John 7:17. Si quis voluerit voluntatem eius facere, cognoscet de doctrina utrum ex Deo sit, an ego a me ipso loquar. If someone wants to do his will, he will know or recognize concerning the teaching whether it is from God or whether I am speaking of my own accord. The speaker here is Jesus, and he's continuing the discourse that he began in the previous verse. And there's a number of interesting syntactical things to discuss here, so I hope you can settle in for a slightly longer video. I hope you'll be patient with me because I think lingering over conditional sentences in particular, which is one of the things that we have here, is worthwhile since it's often difficult for beginning and intermediate students as a concept to master. So we're going to spend a little bit of extra time on this. First of all, let's mark out the two parts of the conditional sentence. Normally there are two clauses, the conditional clause proper and the main clause. In this case, we're going to drop a comma after facere. We're going to outline the conditional clause proper, which begins with C, which is the typical marker in Latin. And we're going to remind ourselves that the most common term by which this conditional clause proper is known is the protasis, and the clause which follows it, the main clause, which includes in this sentence everything afterwards, is very often called the apodosis. These are Greek terms which have been adapted to the study of Latin grammar. Protasis means something like a going forth, and apodosis means something like a giving back. So there's sort of a tide which flows out and a tide which flows back in terms of the sense of, hey, here's a possible situation or even a situation that is currently existing, or even a situation we're imagining that isn't existing or couldn't exist. And then here's the logical consequence that flows back from that. That's kind of the way to think about the two parts of a conditional sentence. These have other names depending on the textbook. Sometimes the protasis is called the antecedent. Sometimes the apodosis is called the consequent. Really just depends which book you're referring to. And when these categories were standardized, particularly in the 19th century, different grammarians fell into different camps in terms of how to describe the different types of conditional sentences and how to categorize them. There were some differences of opinion on that, and those things persisted into the 20th and indeed into the 21st centuries. And that's one of the causes sometimes of confusion that students feel about how to recognize and talk about and use conditional sentences. I think the other thing, based on my teaching experience, that can make conditional sentences difficult for students is recognizing the different types depends on having a strong grasp of Latin morphology, particularly verb morphology. And sometimes beginning or intermediate students are still struggling with that a little bit. And so that makes recognizing and analyzing a more complex kind of construction like the conditional sentence just all the more difficult if, again, your morphology is still a little bit shaky or a little bit confused. So if you find conditional sentences difficult, don't despair. That's very common. This is an aspect of Latin grammar that takes many people a little bit longer to master than some of the other constructions. So you're in good company if you frequently have to go back and refer to your grammar and say, well, how does all of this work again? And again, that task is complicated by the fact that if you pick up this grammar or that grammar, they might call the different types of conditional sentences by different names. They might use different terminology or even different conceptual categories to talk about these things. And that doesn't necessarily do the modern student any favors. If you like to compare grammars and the different ways that they talk about things, it can be interesting in terms of the history of Latin grammar and how people have thought about Latin grammar. But for most of us, it can just sort of get in the way. We're going to talk more about the type of sentence that we have here in a moment, but first let's give our attention to morphology. What kind of verbs do we have here governing the protasis and the apodosis? First of all, we need to look at valueret. Now, valueret gives us an immediate ambiguity because it can be parsed in two different ways. It could be the third person singular, future perfect, active, or it could theoretically be, because these are coincident forms, they look the same superficially, it could be the third person singular, perfect, subjunctive, active. How are we going to decide between those two options? Well, let's put a fork in that for the moment. Let's look at the verb in the main clause, which is cognoscet. And the thing I want you to notice right away is cognoscet with an E, not cognoscit, which would be the third person singular, present active indicative. And it's also not cognoscat, which would be the third person singular, present active subjunctive. Instead, we get cognoscet, which in fact is unambiguously the third person future active indicative. He will know or he will recognize in this case. So that right away is actually going to help us out with our little mystery surrounding valueret. It does sometimes happen that you get what are called mixed conditionals, that is, conditionals that don't seem to follow one of the typical patterns that are identified as particular types or species of conditional sentences in the grammar books. So we don't want to immediately say, well, of course this can't be the perfect subjunctive. But it is really unlikely to be the perfect subjunctive, especially since we've got a future form, an indicative future form in the main clause. That's going to incline us to say probably what we've got in the protasis is a future perfect, because that makes a kind of match in as much as both are future forms. And in fact, our conviction that valueret is a future perfect is going to be strengthened by the knowledge we gain from experience of reading Latin texts over time, which tells us this combination is in fact very common. That is to see the future perfect indicative in the protasis, or just the future indicative, followed by the future indicative in the apodosis. That's a super common pattern. So when we see that option here, based on our experience, we're going to move the needle towards future perfect and say, that seems to be much more likely. That follows one of the standard patterns, and I've seen this many times before. So future perfect is what we've got here. If someone literally will have wished, will have wanted to do what? To do the will of him, that is, to do the will of God the Father, and so forth. Now, in English, idiomatically, we translate conditional sentences a little bit differently. We're less precise about tense than Latin is. So in English, we'd probably say idiomatically, if someone wants to do his will, he will know or he will recognize, etc. That's what you find in most professional Bible translations. But we need to know when we're looking at the Latin text, this is technically a future perfect. It's envisioning this action as both in the future and completed before the action described by cognoscet. And that's just good to be aware of because tense really matters a lot in Latin, which, as we said, is very precise about such things. So if somebody wants, in English we'd say, to do his will, more precisely following the Latin, if somebody will have wanted or will have wished to do his will, then we merge into the apodosis. He will know, he will recognize, concerning the teaching, and this follows the construction in the original Greek text very closely. He will recognize or know concerning the teaching, and then, just to make things more complicated, inset within the apodosis here, we get an indirect question introduced by utrum and on, both of which together give a pair of alternatives. That is, they say whether or. Now, we know that indirect questions generally take the subjunctive mood. That is, when a question is being reported or related through the thoughts or speech or perception of somebody else, we're going to use the subjunctive mood for the verb indicating what is being asked or what is being wondered. So he will recognize or know concerning the teaching whether it is, we would say in English, from God, or whether, and here's the other alternative, whether I, Jesus, am speaking first person singular, present, subjunctive, active in sense, although this is passive in form. It's passive in form because you'll remember that loqui is a deponent verb. Okay, don't be confused by that. So that's a present subjunctive, just like sit, and for the same reason, because it's introduced by an indirect question. He will know whether this teaching is from God, on the one hand, that's one possibility, or the other possibility, he'll know that I am speaking a me ipso, on my own account, from my own mind, on my own authority. Something like that is what we would say in English. Okay, but let's back up and resolve our question about this conditional. What kind of conditional is it? What should we call it? Well, traditionally, we'd call it a future, more vivid conditional. That's what it would be called according to several of the most commonly used Latin grammars. But there's other ways to think and talk about conditional sentences. I like the categories used by Harm Pinkster in the Oxford Latin syntax. He breaks all conditional sentences down into three categories. He calls these categories the realis, the potentialis, and the irrealis. And each of these corresponds to the use of particular moods and tenses. So very briefly, we can point out that the realis category generally talks about facts, things which are pretty certain in the present or in the future or in the past. They're presented as definitely happening in one of those time domains. And generally we find the indicative in such sentences in both the protasis and apodosis. He also talks about the potentialis as describing possible events of a somewhat less probable or fixed or certain nature. So these are, more strictly speaking, hypothetical situations, and in those we tend to find the subjunctive, particularly the present and perfect subjunctive, in protasis and apodosis. And he also talks about the irrealis kind of condition, which are literally unreal conditions, in which we're going to find either the imperfect or the pluperfect subjunctive in protasis and apodosis to indicate things which could be happening but aren't, or could have happened in the past but didn't. Hence the idea that these are unreal conditionals. They describe situations that can't be happening or couldn't be happening in the past. So let's call these unreal. Sometimes they're also called counterfactual or contrafactual. Those are other terms typically used in other grammars. So I find this tripartite division really simple and intuitive and worth learning, particularly if you struggle with the typical categories, the categories that you find more commonly in Latin grammars. If those really muddle your thinking and prove to be more of a hindrance than a help, try thinking about things according to these terms. And again, you can refer to Harm Pinkster's grammar to see how he explains those and gives examples of them. But really, we don't want to exaggerate the difficulty of conditional sentences altogether. I would like to just affirm you are capable, fully capable, of mastering whatever system you first learned, and maybe that's the best place to start, is with the way that conditional sentences were first introduced to you. You certainly can learn and memorize and apply those categories. I don't mean to discourage you from doing that, but if you've tried that many times and you're still struggling, give this way of thinking about things a try. It's a slight adjustment of the typical way of categorizing stuff. I find it helpful. Perhaps you will too. I don't know. It depends on the person. So if we apply this taxonomy to this particular sentence, we would say, What we've got here is kind of a type 1 conditional. This is a realis type conditional because we're talking about facts. Jesus is saying, if a person wants to do the will of God, not potentially may want or not might have wanted but didn't or anything like that, but if a person wants to do the will of God, he will for sure, as a logical consequence, cognoscet, he will recognize or know concerning the teaching, etc. We're dealing here with a situation that is conceived of by the speaker as dealing in solid, factual situations. And that's why we find the future perfect in the protasis and a corresponding future indicative in the main clause.